The word landed in the middle of Cora Beckett's chest like a brand pressed to flesh. Willful. She stood in the doorway of the Hargrove parlor, the late afternoon sun of Redemption Falls, Texas burning orange behind her, and she watched Harold Finch push back his chair with the kind of deliberate slowness that men use when they want the whole room to feel their disappointment. He was 41 years old, barrel-chested, with a mustache that sat on his upper lip like something had crawled there and died. He had ridden in from Amarillo with a letter of introduction from Reverend Calloway and $300 in a money clip, and he had spent the better part of an hour explaining to Cora the correct way a woman ought to hold her tongue. She had explained something back to him. She had explained it using a land survey map she pulled from her own satchel, one she had drafted herself using a girly transit she had bartered for with 3 months of labor, and she had shown Harold Finch, clearly and without a single wasted syllable, that the south pasture he intended to purchase from Thomas Hargrove was positioned directly over a dried creek bed that flooded every February without fail, that the deed he was holding was misdescribed by 14 acres, and that he was about to hand over $300 for land that would drown his cattle every single winter. Harold Finch had not thanked her. Harold Finch had said the word willful, tucked his money clip back into his breast pocket, and walked out the door with his hat pressed so hard against his head it looked like he was trying to drive it into his skull. Martha Hargrove appeared at Cora's elbow with the expression of a woman watching a carriage wheel roll downhill toward something irreplaceable. She was not unkind, Martha. She was just deeply, profoundly tired of this particular problem repeating itself. "Cora," she said softly. "I saved him $300, Cora said. "You embarrassed him in front of Thomas. Thomas knew about the creek bed. Thomas has known about it for 2 years. Martha pressed her lips together and said nothing for a long moment. Outside, the sound of Harold Finch's horse growing fainter was the loneliest sound Cora had heard in weeks, not because she wanted Harold Finch. She did not want Harold Finch. She would rather share a home with the dried creek bed itself. But because the sound meant that the town of Redemption Falls would talk again, would pass the story across fence posts and store counters, would add one more chapter to the ongoing account of how Cora Beckett was simply too much. "He won't be the last to say it," Martha told her. "I know," Cora said. "You're 24 years old and you are lovely and you are sharp as a whittled branch, and I love you like my own child. But the men in this territory want a woman who makes a home, not a woman who reads a survey." Cora picked up her satchel. She ran her fingers once across the leather strap that had belonged to her father, Jacob Beckett, the finest surveyor in the whole of the Texas Panhandle, the man who had taught her everything she knew, and who had died of fever 3 years ago with his transit instruments carefully wrapped in oilcloth, and his field journals stacked beside his bed as neatly as prayer books. "Then I suppose," Cora said, "I'll wait for a man who knows the difference between a liability and an asset." She walked out into the dry heat of Redemption Falls and headed back toward the small house she rented behind the land office. And she did not cry, because Cora Beckett very rarely cried, but she did stand at her front door for a long moment with her hand on the frame, and let herself feel the particular weight of a life spent being precisely and exactly herself in a world that kept asking her to be something smaller. She did not know, standing there in the July heat of 1882, that a man had arrived in Redemption Falls that same morning. She did not know that he had ridden in from the northeast with dust on his coat and a folded letter in his inside pocket, and a reputation that had preceded him by about 2 weeks, courtesy of a telegraph wire and a cattle broker named Sela's Drum. She did not know his name yet. She would learn it before morning. Owen Crawford had come to Redemption Falls for one reason, and that reason was land. Specifically, he had come for the stretch of grassland that ran north of the Calloway Creek watershed, approximately 40 miles of rolling mesquite flat that a man named Denton Price had been buying up in small parcels and quietly stitching together under 4 different names in 4 different county registries. Owen had been tracking those parcels for 3 months. He had the kind of patience that came from growing up on a ranch in eastern Colorado, where patience was not a virtue but a survival strategy, where the difference between a man who made it through winter and a man who did not often came down to whether he could stay still and watchful long enough to understand what the land was actually telling him. He was 30 years old. He stood 6'2" in his boots and had the kind of shoulders that spoke to a decade of hauling fence post and managing horses that had strong opinions about being managed. His hair was dark, his jaw was sharp, and there was a quality about his eyes, a stillness that people either found reassuring or unsettling, that tended to separate honest folk from dishonest folk with remarkable efficiency. He tied his horse, a dark bay gelding named Prospect, to the rail outside the Redemption Falls land office and pulled out the letter from his inside pocket. The letter was from his father's old partner, a man named George Alderman, who had settled near Redemption Falls 10 years ago and built a modest cattle operation before his knees had given out. George had written to say that the land north of town was worth having, that the grass was good, and the water table was reliable if you knew where to sink a well, and that there was a local surveyor whose maps were the most precise and trustworthy in the territory, because that surveyor had spent 15 years learning the land alongside the county's best. George had not mentioned that the surveyor was a woman. Owen stepped into the land office and found it empty except for a map pinned to the far wall, a hand-drawn topographical survey of the territory that was so detailed, so precise, so clearly the work of someone who had actually walked every contour line, that he stood in front of it for a full 2 minutes before he even looked for the person who had made it. The signature in the lower right corner read, C. Beckett, Surveyor. He asked the county clerk, a nervous little man named Doveridge, about C. Beckett. Doveridge blinked at him. That would be Miss Cora Beckett, daughter of Jacob Beckett, God rest him. She does all the survey work in this county and most of the next. Does it better than her father did, some say, and Jacob Beckett was the best there was. Owen nodded. I need a survey done. North Parcel, the Callaway Creek watershed land. I need it done quickly and accurately, and I need to know if there are any recording irregularities in the county deeds. Doveridge looked at him with a complicated expression. You know about the Price situation? I know enough. Doveridge dropped his voice. Then you want Cora Beckett. She's already flagged 3 of those parcels for irregular descriptions. Price's man came in here last month and told her to mind her work, and she told him that surveying accurate land descriptions was her work, and then she wrote a letter to the county assessor that made Price's man turn 3 different colors when he read it. Owen Crawford almost smiled. Where do I find her? He found her at the house behind the land office, just as the sun was going down, and he found her in the middle of something that made him stop walking and simply stand and watch. She was in the small side yard with a surveying transit set up on a tripod, and she was measuring the angle of a distant ridge line in the dying light, and the way she moved around that instrument was the way a musician moves around the thing they have spent a lifetime learning. She checked the level bubble, adjusted the tangent screw with 2 fingers, pressed her eye to the scope, and wrote in her field book without looking down because she did not need to look down, because the numbers came from her hands directly to the page. She was wearing a practical dark skirt and a white cotton shirtwaist with the sleeves rolled to her elbows, and her dark hair was twisted up under a wide-brimmed hat, and she had the kind of beauty that did not perform itself, that simply existed and did not much care if you noticed. He noticed. He cleared his throat. She did not look up. I'll be with you in a moment. He waited. She finished her reading, wrote 2 more numbers, closed the field book with a specific kind of satisfaction that he recognized from years of finishing a thing you had set out to do precisely right, and then she turned. She looked at him for a long moment without speaking, the way people do when they are quietly assembling an assessment. Owen Crawford, he said, and touched his hat brim. Cora Beckett, she said, you're the man who wired George Alderman about the North Parcel. I am. Doveridge told you to come to me. He did. You want a survey and a deed review before you make an offer on land that Denton Price is trying to tie up. He was quiet for a moment, recalibrating, because he had not mentioned Price to Doveridge, and Doveridge had not volunteered that she already knew the broader shape of the situation. Yes. She studied him with those clear, direct eyes. Most men coming in to buy land in this county are either working for Price or working against him. Which are you? Against, he said, firmly. Something shifted in her expression. Not softness, not yet, but a kind of recalibration that mirrored his own. I'll need 3 days to do it right, she said. Field survey on days 1 and 2, records review on day 3. My rate is $2 a day plus expenses. Fair, he said. It's not negotiable, she said, reading him wrong. I said it was fair, he said. She paused. Most men try to get the rate down. Most men are fools with their money. That was the first moment. Not the moment of attraction, not quite, but the first moment in which something in Cora Beckett's chest moved slightly to the left, as if making room for something she had not expected to have to make room for. She told him to meet her at the land office at first light. He was there 15 minutes before first light. She arrived 12 minutes before first light, saw him already mounted and waiting in the dark, and said nothing, but adjusted her opinion of him by a small but significant increment. They rode north together in the pre-dawn quiet of the Texas grassland, and the world was the color of charcoal and indigo, and the grass moved in the wind like something breathing. And Cora Beckett led the way because she knew every inch of this land, and Owen Crawford followed because following someone who knew the ground better than you was not weakness. It was intelligence. She set up the transit at the first benchmark by the time the sun was fully clearing the horizon, and Owen watched her work with the quiet attention he gave to things worth understanding. She moved with efficiency and certainty, driving stakes, stretching measuring chains, calling back bearings and distances to herself in a low voice as she recorded them, cross-checking her readings with the kind of habitual rigor that only came from having been taught by someone who believed that a wrong measurement compounded forward into every subsequent decision. Your father taught you this, he said, not a question. From the time I was 8 years old, she said, pressing her eye to the scope. He said the land doesn't lie. He said people lie, and documents lie, and money lies, but the land just sits there being itself, and you either learn to read it accurately or you don't. He sounds like a man worth knowing. She was quiet for a moment. He was the best man I ever knew. He died 3 years ago. I'm sorry. She pulled back from the scope, wrote the reading, moved to the next setup without dwelling in the grief, because grief was a thing she had learned to carry inside her movement rather than stopping for it. He left me the instruments and the field journals and a small amount of cash. He also left me a reputation that half the county wants to use and half the county wants to suppress, depending on whether they need an honest survey or want a dishonest one. Price in the second camp. Price has been in the second camp since I flagged his first parcel 14 months ago. She was walking the chain now, counting her paces with automatic precision. He sent a man named Culver to see me. Culver was not subtle. He offered me money to file corrected surveys with generous descriptions that would benefit Price's parcels. What did you do? She looked back at him over her shoulder with an expression that said she found the question slightly insulting in its obviousness. I showed him the door, and since then there have been smaller pressures, a formal complaint to the county assessor that was reviewed and dismissed. A rumor circulated that my surveys were unreliable, which was also reviewed and dismissed by anyone who compared them to the physical land, and a general ongoing effort to make my life in this county uncomfortable enough that I would take the money or leave. But you stayed. My father surveyed this land for 15 years, she said simply. These are his benchmarks in the ground. Every iron pin in this county was set by his hands or mine. I am not leaving. Owen Crawford listened to her say that, and something in his chest did something it had not done in a long time. He was not a man given to romantic notions. He had been engaged once briefly, to a woman in Denver who had ultimately decided that the gap between a working cattleman's life and the life she had imagined for herself was unbridgeable. He had not argued with her. He had understood that some gaps were real, but he had not, in the years since, met a woman who made him feel the way that Cora Beckett's simple declaration made him feel, which was something close to recognition. Like hearing a sentence spoken correctly after a long time of hearing it said wrong. They worked through the heat of the day without stopping except to water the horses and eat the bread and dried beef that Cora had packed with the same practical efficiency she brought to everything. By mid-afternoon, they had covered the eastern boundary of the north parcel and had already found the first irregularity. It was a missing iron pin at a southwest corner, replaced by a painted wooden stake, which was not legal description and not survey standard, and which had been driven at a position approximately 60 feet south of where the legal pin should have been. 60 feet of mesquite flat along a boundary line might not sound like much. Along a line that ran 2 miles, it was 37 acres. Cora photographed the location in her field book, recorded the bearing and distance from the nearest existing iron pin, and marked the painted stake with a strip of red cloth from her saddlebag. "Someone moved this boundary," Owen said, crouching over the stake. "Someone moved this boundary," she agreed, "and filed a deed description that matches the moved stake, not the original survey. The original survey is in my father's field journals with the exact bearing and distance from the section corner." He looked up at her. "That's evidence of deed fraud. That is evidence of deed fraud," she said. "I have been collecting it for 14 months. He stood. He was looking at her now with something in his expression that she had not seen on a man's face before, not aimed at her anyway. It was not the look of a man who found her threatening or absurd or unfeminine. It was the look of a man encountering a capability that he had not anticipated and that genuinely impressed him. "How many stakes have been moved?" he asked. "On the land you're looking at, I suspect 3 more. There may be a 4th at the north line. We'll find it tomorrow. And the county assessor knows all of this. The county assessor knows some of it. The county assessor is also a man who owes Denton Price a favor or two and has been moving slowly." She pulled her hat brim down against the lowering sun. "Which is why I have been waiting for someone with legal standing to bring a formal challenge. A buyer with documented evidence of fraud in the land he intends to purchase has standing I don't have as a private surveyor." He understood then the complete shape of what she was doing. She had not simply been doing her job for 14 months. She had been building a case methodically, precisely, with the same rigor she brought to every line on every map, waiting for the right person to arrive and complete it. "You knew I was coming," he said. "I knew someone like you would come eventually," she said. "Land as good as this can't stay in fraudulent hands forever. Someone would come to buy it honestly. And you need that someone to have the fraud exposed in time. Before Price consolidates the deeds under one name and gets them recorded in a different county. Once that happens, untangling it becomes a legal battle that could take years, and Price has more money for lawyers than I have for anything." Owen Crawford stood in the long afternoon light of the north parcel and looked at Cora Beckett and thought that she was quite possibly the most formidable person he had met in the state of Texas, and he had met several governors. "Tell me what you need from me," he said. She told him. By the time they rode back to Redemption Falls, the stars were coming out in the immense Texas sky, and the coyotes were singing somewhere to the west, and they had talked for 6 hours and covered more ground together, figuratively and literally, than some people covered in a year of acquaintance. He had told her about his father's ranch in Colorado, about the years of working his way toward enough capital to buy his own land, about the cattle broker Silas Drum, who had told him about the Texas grassland, with a cattleman's enthusiasm for grass that could carry 200 head without much effort. She had told him about her father's field journals, 30 years of surveys recorded in a hand so precise and consistent that the journals were more reliable than half the official records in the county office. She had told him about the 3 men before Harold Finch who had been proposed as matches for her by well-meaning neighbors, and she had told it without bitterness, but with a dry, quiet humor that made Owen laugh in the dark on the open road, a laugh that surprised him with its ease. "The first one," she said, "told me that he respected a woman with a hobby." "A hobby," Owen repeated. "I showed him my transit and he said it was a very serious-looking hobby. That was the end of that. The second. The second was kind and decent and genuinely good, and we got along very well for about 3 weeks, and then he proposed that after we married I could keep my surveying work as long as I did it only in the county immediately surrounding our home and did not take work from men because it made them feel unnecessary." Owen was quiet for a moment. "And the third?" "The third was Harold Finch, this afternoon. He tried to buy land that would have drowned his cattle. I explained why, and he used the word willful and left. What would have been the correct response to an accurate survey? I suppose the correct response would have been to thank me and not buy the land and have all his cattle alive next February. That seems like it would be worth some willfulness." She glanced at him sideways in the dark, and in the moonlight he could see the corner of something in her expression that might, in better light, have been called a smile. "That is," she said, "a refreshingly rational perspective." They parted at the land office with a handshake that was businesslike and correct, and that lasted perhaps 2 seconds longer than a purely businesslike handshake needed to. Cora went home and sat at her father's desk and looked at the field journals stacked beside her own, and felt something she had not felt in a long time, which was the particular internal sensation of having been seen clearly and found interesting rather than problematic. She did not let herself dwell on it. She was a practical woman. She had work to do in the morning. Owen went back to the room he had taken at the Redemption Falls boarding house, run by a widow named Herschel who served an excellent beef stew and asked no personal questions. And he lay on the narrow bed and looked at the ceiling and thought about the way Cora Beckett moved around a surveying transit, and the way she had said my father's benchmarks are in this ground as if she were speaking about something sacred. He thought it was probably sacred. He thought she was the most interesting person he had met since a geologist he had once ridden with in Colorado, who had stopped every 2 miles to identify rock formations, and who had spoken about stones with the same reverence that other people reserved for God. He was not sure when exactly he had begun to think that interesting and beautiful were the same word. He suspected it had something to do with the woman who had just shaken his hand in the dark outside a land office in a small Texas town, and it was a thought he decided not to examine too closely before he had more sleep and less moonlight making things seem more significant than they were. But the moonlight did not change what it was. The second day of the survey brought a problem that was not about land. It arrived in the form of 2 men who rode out from the south on good horses, with that particular quality of movement that said they were not farmers, not cowboys going about regular business, but men being paid to deliver a message through their presence. Cora saw them coming across the flat land while she was still 300 yards from the north boundary. She recognized the lead rider as Culver, the man who had come to her door 14 months ago with Price's money. The second man she did not know, but she noted that he was younger and bigger than Culver, and that he was riding with his right hand close to his holster in the way that men do when they want you to notice where their hand is. She continued setting up her transit. Owen, who had been driving a stake 50 yards north, straightened and saw them coming and walked back toward her with the kind of unhurried certainty that very confident men use when they want to communicate that nothing happening has disrupted their intentions. He stood beside her as the 2 riders pulled up. "Miss Beckett," Culver said, "didn't expect to find you all the way out here." "This is where the north parcel boundary is," she said pleasantly, leveling the instrument bubble. "So this is where I am." Culver's eyes moved to Owen. "Crawford, heard you were in town looking at land." "Heard right," Owen said. "Mr. Price wants you to know he's prepared to be very fair on a deal for this acreage. Very fair. No need to get into all the complications of a full survey. The survey is already started, Owen said. 3 days' work. Culver shifted in his saddle. The county has accepted surveys on file for this land. No need to duplicate the work. The county surveys contain errors, Cora said, without looking up from her scope. I've documented 4 boundary discrepancies so far, and we're only halfway through the eastern parcels. The silence that followed had a specific texture. Culver looked at the second man, the bigger one with the hand near the holster, and something passed between them that was not subtle. Owen stepped 1 step forward, which was a small movement but a very clear one. "I think you have the information you came to deliver," Owen said. "Which is that Mr. Price would prefer the survey not be completed." "We've received it. We're going to continue the survey. Is there anything else?" Culver looked at Owen for a long moment with the kind of look that men use to measure whether the other man will hold his ground. Owen Crawford was the kind of man who made that measurement very straightforward. He held his ground the way iron pins held the earth, quietly, firmly, and without any interest in being moved. "Just friendly conversation," Culver said. "Friendly conversation is welcome," Owen said. "Anything else is not." They rode away to the south. Cora watched them go in the flat reflection of the transit scope before she pulled back and wrote her readings. "They'll be back," she said. "Probably," Owen agreed. "Culver has never been physically threatening. He works through pressure and inconvenience, not force, but the second man was new. I noticed. What do you know about Price's actual operation? How many men does he have on the payroll?" "He has a ranch foreman named Barton who runs about 8 men. Barton is straightforward, a cattle operation man. I don't think he's involved in the land scheme. The fraud work is Culver's department, 3 or 4 men who do not appear on any ranch payroll I can find." Owen was quiet for a moment. "You've looked at his payroll records." "I've looked at everything that's public record," she said simply. "When someone is trying to destroy the honest practice of land surveying in the county where my father's work lives, I pay attention to them." He was watching her again with that expression she was beginning to recognize, the expression of genuine admiration, uncomplicated by threat, unqualified by expectation. "I think," he said carefully, "that when we file the formal challenge to the deed records, we need to do it in person and in Amarillo, not through Doveridge in the county office." "I think so too," she said. "Doveridge is not dishonest, but he is not brave. If Price applies pressure, he'll delay. How long would it take you to prepare a full documentation package? Survey evidence, the field journal comparisons, the deed description discrepancies. If I work tonight and tomorrow evening, I'll have it complete after the 3rd day's records review. Then we ride to Amarillo in 4 days," he said. The word "we" sat in the open air between them, and neither of them commented on it, and both of them heard it. The 3rd day of work was the records review, and it was done in the county office with Cora's father's field journals opened side by side, with the official deed records on Doveridge's largest table. Owen sat across from her and read documents while she cross-referenced measurements, and they worked in a focused quiet for 6 hours with the kind of easy, unspoken coordination that usually takes years to develop between 2 people. By mid-afternoon, Cora had documented 7 separate deed descriptions that materially diverged from the original survey positions. In 4 cases, the divergence was small enough to be argued as error. In 3 cases, including the southwest corner stake Owen had seen in the field, the divergence was too large and too consistently beneficial to Price to be anything but intentional. 7, Owen said, sitting back. 7, she confirmed. She had them organized in a leather document case by parcel number, with the corresponding field journal page flagged and the measurement discrepancy noted in her precise, unhurried handwriting. "This is a criminal matter," he said. "Yes. Not just a civil land dispute. No, the deed descriptions were filed by a licensed surveyor named Garvey who worked for Price. Garvey left the county 8 months ago, and I have not been able to determine where he went. If he's found, there's testimony here. If he's not found, the documents themselves are evidence enough." Owen was watching her across the table. "Cora," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name without the title, and she noticed it the way you notice the moment when the temperature shifts, when the air changes quality before a storm. "You have been carrying this by yourself for 14 months, he said. It was not quite a question. "It was my work to do," she said. "Yes, but you've also been managing Price's pressure alone, and building a case that most lawyers would need a partner to build, and doing your regular survey work on top of it, and being proposed to by a series of inadequate men, and apparently having it all be your fault for being too willful to accept any of it gracefully." The way he said the word willful, with a kind of dry contempt for the concept as applied to her, did something specific to Cora's composure. She held it together because she was a practical woman, but her hands went still on the field journal for a moment. "The town has not been unkind," she said carefully. "Martha Hargrove has been genuinely kind. George Alderman's wife sends me preserves every autumn. The county assessor's deputy, a young man named Ferris, has covered for me twice when Culver tried to access my survey files during off hours. But no one has stood beside you on this. No one had the standing to stand beside me on this until you arrived." He let that sit. He let it sit the way he let most things sit, with patience and without artificial resolution. "I have the standing now," he said, "and I intend to use it, but I want to be clear about something." He leaned forward slightly, elbows on the table, and looked at her directly. "I am not here to rescue you. I am here because you built something solid and true, and I want to be part of completing it. The difference matters to me." Cora Beckett looked at Owen Crawford across the table in the county land office of Redemption Falls, Texas, on the 3rd day of July, 1882, and felt the thing that she had been not letting herself feel for 3 days clarify into something she could actually name. "The difference matters to me too," she said quietly. They packed the document case that evening, and Cora prepared for the ride to Amarillo in a way that was purely practical. She put her best survey maps in the tube, organized the field journals in order, wrote a summary letter to the Amarillo County Assessor's office that laid out the fraud case in clear, numbered points. She was sealing the letter when there was a knock at her door. She opened it and found Owen standing on her porch with his hat in his hand, which was unusual enough that she registered it immediately. He was a man who generally looked entirely at ease in his own skin, and right now he looked slightly less at ease than usual, which on him manifested as a kind of careful stillness. "There's something I need to say to you," he said, "that is entirely separate from the business." She stepped back from the door and let him in. He came into the small front room and stood with his hat in both hands and looked at her lamplit sitting room with his father's journals on the shelf and her transit in the corner and her field boots drying by the door. "I have not talked to a person the way I have talked to you in a long time," he said, "possibly ever. And I am a man who generally knows his own mind without much difficulty, so I want to say clearly what I know, which is that I would like the opportunity to continue talking to you past the business of this land purchase, assuming you have any inclination in that direction." Cora studied him. "That is a very careful way to say something." "I'm trying to be honest without pressure," he said. "You've had enough pressure." The small sound she made was not quite a laugh and not quite a breath. It was something in between, surprised out of her. "Owen, you rode out at 15 minutes before dawn and waited in the dark. You stepped in front of Culver without a word of discussion. You spent 6 hours reading deed records without a single complaint. You told me the difference between rescuing and partnering matters to you." She paused. "I'm a woman who reads land accurately. I have read this clearly for 3 days. He looked at her for a moment. And I have a very strong inclination in that direction," she said. "I thought I ought to make that clear too, since we are being honest." He crossed the small room in 2 steps, and she did not step back, and he took her hand between both of his, the large, calloused hands of a man who had worked the land, and he held it with a gentleness that was not in any way at odds with the strength she had seen in him all week. He pressed his lips to her knuckles, which was formal and old-fashioned and entirely right for who he was, and then he looked up at her with those still, dark eyes, and she thought that she had spent 24 years being labeled too much, and here was a man who looked at the full sum of her and thought it sounded exactly right. "I'll be here at dawn," he said, releasing her hand. "I'll be ready at 10 minutes before dawn," she said. He smiled at that, and it was a wide, genuine smile that changed the geography of his face entirely, and she thought she would spend a good deal of the next 40 years trying to earn that smile on a regular basis. She slept better that night than she had in 3 years. The ride to Amarillo took 2 days, camping under the open sky where the stars came down so close over the Texas flat that it felt like the sky was leaning in to listen. They shared the practical duties of camp with the same wordless efficiency they brought to everything else, and they talked in the way that people talk around a fire when the darkness and the distance from ordinary life creates a permission for honesty. He told her about his mother, a woman of uncommon strength who had homesteaded with his father in Colorado when the winters were brutal and the markets were unreliable, and who had kept meticulous financial records that had saved the ranch twice over when his father's more ambitious instincts had run ahead of the cash available. He told it with an admiration that was uncomplicated by any need to qualify it, and Cora heard in it the origin story of a man who did not find capable women alarming. She told him about the year after her father died, the months of figuring out how to carry the work forward alone, how to negotiate for her own rate when men who had hired her father for years tried to pay her less because she was younger and a woman, how she had done every job at the same standard and refused every reduction until the work spoke loudly enough that the reduction stopped. "How long did that take?" he asked. "About 8 months," she said. "The 8th month was when I correctly identified an error in a neighboring county's section survey that had been wrong for 20 years, and that was causing a boundary dispute between 2 ranches. When it was fixed, both ranchers shook my hand and told everyone in the county." She looked at the fire. "After that, the rate discussions mostly went away. Your father would have been proud. He would have said I should have charged more." Owen laughed at that, the easy laugh she was becoming addicted to, and she watched the firelight on his face and thought about her father's firm belief that the land doesn't lie, and thought that there was a person version of that principle, that some people simply were what they were without performance or concealment, and that those were the rarest and most valuable people in the world. She thought Owen Crawford was one of those people. They arrived in Amarillo on the afternoon of the 3rd day and went directly to the county assessor's office, where Cora presented her documentation package to a man named Harker who was gray-haired and methodical, and who read the summary letter 3 times before he looked up. "This is substantial," Harker said. "It's accurate," Cora said. "The field journals are original documents, not copies. Original in my father's hand with my father's signature and survey date on every entry." Harker looked at Owen. "And you are the prospective buyer withstanding to file the formal challenge." "I am. I have the capital to purchase the parcels at fair value once the deed descriptions are corrected to match the original surveys." Harker looked back at the documentation. "Garvey," he said, "this name keeps appearing." "Garvey filed the fraudulent deed descriptions," Cora said. "He left the county 8 months ago. I don't know his whereabouts." "I might," Harker said. He was quiet for a moment. "There's a Garvey, a licensed surveyor from the Texas Panhandle, who filed for work in New Mexico territory about 9 months ago. If it's the same man, he's been doing survey work in Lincoln County." This was new information. Cora and Owen exchanged a glance. Could testimony be obtained from him? Owen asked. "If he's still in New Mexico, and if he has any interest in being honest, possibly. But the documentary evidence you have here is strong enough to open a formal investigation without his testimony." Harker closed the folder and folded his hands on top of it. "I am going to tell you that Denton Price has connections in this county and in the state capital, and that this process will not be without resistance." "I imagine not," Owen said. I'm also going to tell you that the documentation in this folder is the most thorough and precise fraud case I have reviewed in 15 years in this office, and that it is going to be extremely difficult to argue with. He looked at Cora directly. Miss Beckett, I knew your father. He surveyed the land on which my family's home is built. I am going to take what you have brought me very seriously. Cora sat quietly for a moment with the weight of her father's name in the room. Thank you, she said. They filed the formal challenge that afternoon and stayed overnight in Amarillo to sign the accompanying affidavits the following morning. The hotel was a proper Amarillo establishment called the Grand, and it had separate rooms on separate floors. And when Owen walked Cora to her door on the second-floor landing, he held her hand in the hallway with the lamp flickering between them and said, in a voice that was entirely level, that he had something to ask her. Ask it, she said. I want to do this right, he said. I want to court you properly, and I want to be clear about my intentions, and I don't want to rush something that deserves to be given enough time to be done right. That is very responsible, she said. It also might take longer than I actually wanted to take, he admitted, and the honesty of that made her laugh. I'm asking how you feel about that, about time, about patience. She thought about it. She was not a woman who said what she thought she was supposed to say. She was a woman who said what was true. I have been waiting a long time, she said carefully, for a man worth taking time for. Having found him, I am not in a great hurry to artificially extend the waiting. I think the appropriate amount of time is however long it takes to be certain, and I think the amount of time it takes to be certain is different for every two people and not answerable in a hallway in Amarillo. He was quiet for a long moment. That is the most sensible and also the most hopeful thing I have ever heard. Good night, Owen. Good night, Cora. She went into her room and sat on the bed and pressed both hands flat to her knees and breathed steadily, and felt something enormous moving through her like weather, like the shift before a good rain, like the feeling just before the land opens up into a vista you have not seen before. She thought her father would have liked Owen Crawford very much. She thought that fact mattered to her more than she had words to explain. Back in Redemption Falls, word had moved the way word moved in small frontier towns, quickly, selectively, and with generous embellishment. By the time Owen and Cora returned from Amarillo, the story that was circulating involved a formal legal challenge to Denton Price's land consolidation. A woman who had single-handedly documented 3 years of deed fraud, and a man who had ridden out to Texas to buy grassland and had apparently taken an interest in considerably more than grassland. Martha Hargrove met Cora on the front step of the land office with both hands extended and a light in her eyes that Cora found somewhat alarming in its enthusiasm. The whole town is talking, Martha said, about the fraud case. About everything, Martha said, with the specific weight of a woman who means something much larger than land records. About you and Mr. Crawford. She squeezed Cora's hands. Cora, he asked Thomas this morning if he might call on you formally. Cora went still. He asked Thomas. Thomas is the closest thing you have to a family elder in this town, and Mr. Crawford apparently knows how to do things properly. Martha was beaming in a way that was almost combustible. Thomas said yes, obviously, and also gave him a 15-minute speech about your qualities, which I am told Mr. Crawford listened to without interruption, and then said he was in complete agreement with all of it. Cora stood on the step in the July heat of Redemption Falls and felt warmth of a kind that had nothing to do with the Texas summer. Thomas's speech about my qualities, she said. I may have written a few of the talking points, Martha admitted. Cora laughed. It came up from deep in her chest the way good laughs do, the kind you cannot plan or perform, and Martha laughed with her. And the town square of Redemption Falls baked quietly in the afternoon heat around them, and somewhere a horse tossed its head, and the windmill behind the livery squeaked in the wind, and the world was completely ordinary and completely good. Owen called that evening at 7 o'clock, as arranged. with his hat properly in his hand and a jar of wildflower honey that he said he had gotten from a beekeeper on the road east of town, because he had not been sure what one brought, and the beekeeper had suggested that honey was generally well received. Cora took the honey with great solemnity and invited him in and made coffee, and they sat at her front room table and talked for 4 hours about cattle grass and survey mathematics and the particular quality of the light over the Texas Panhandle in late afternoon, and the novels that Cora had read from the small library she had assembled since her father died, and the long winter cattle drives that Owen had ridden in his 20s, and the dreams each of them had for a piece of land that was genuinely theirs. When he left at 11 o'clock, he stood on her porch for a moment, and the air smelled of dust and dry grass and the far-off possibility of rain, and he turned to her and said, with the same level honesty he brought to everything, "I think you are the most extraordinary person I have met in my life." She had been called many things. She had been called too much, too willful, too sharp, too independent, too certain of her own mind, too unlikely to make a man comfortable. She had been called all of these things by men who wanted a smaller version of her and could not understand why she would not provide it. She had never been called extraordinary. She breathed it in and let it settle beside her heart where it belonged. "I think you are someone I would like to know for a very long time," she said. "That works out well," he said, "because I have no plans to leave." The formal fraud investigation moved over the following months with the grinding deliberateness of institutional process, interrupted occasionally by the sharp application of pressure. Price, through his lawyers in Amarillo and a state capital connection in Austin, filed 3 counter-motions, each designed to delay the proceedings and discredit the survey documentation. Each was addressed in turn. The first by Harker's office presenting the original field journals, the second by a deposition from the county assessor's deputy Ferris confirming the documented access attempts to Cora's survey files, and the third, most critically, by a letter from Lincoln County, New Mexico Territory, where a surveyor named Edmund Garvey had been located and had, after some months of deliberation, decided that his continued professional license and personal freedom were worth more than his loyalty to a man who had already abandoned him in a different state. Garvey's letter, conveyed through the Amarillo assessor's office, described in precise detail the instructions he had received from Culver on behalf of Price, the parcels on which he had misdescribed boundaries, and the amounts he had been paid for each falsified filing. It was not a complete confession. It was carefully worded and protected Garvey's own liability as much as it could. But it corroborated every point in Cora's documentation and added the direct link to Price that the deed records alone could not provide. When Cora read it in Harker's office in Amarillo in October, 3 months after she and Owen had first filed the challenge, she sat very still for a moment. "This is it," she said. "This is it," Harker confirmed. Price's consolidation was voided. The parcels were returned to their correct legal descriptions. 3 of the 5 original sellers were found to have been defrauded of acreage in their sales prices and received compensation. Culver was indicted on fraud conspiracy charges in Amarillo and left the territory before he could be arrested, which was unsatisfying but not uncommon. Price himself faced civil action, but his lawyers were good enough, and his connections were significant enough that he ultimately paid a fine, lost the land, and retained his freedom, which was an injustice that Cora acknowledged clearly and without pretending it was otherwise. "He should have faced criminal charges," she said, in the flat Texas wind outside the Amarillo courthouse. "Yes," Owen said, "he should have. He won't. No, the law in this territory is still a work in progress." She turned her face into the wind, which had the sharp edge of the approaching autumn in it. "My father used to say that the land keeps honest records even when people don't. That the benchmarks stay where you drive them regardless of what anyone files at the courthouse. That eventually the truth of a thing shows up in the measurements." Owen stood beside her and listened. The land knew, she said simply. 14 months of accurate surveys and the land kept the record. That's enough. He took her hand there on the courthouse steps of Amarillo, Texas, in October of 1882, and it was the most public holding of her hand that had occurred so far, and several people passing by in the street witnessed it, and Cora Beckett, who had spent her life being labeled too willful for any decent arrangement, felt the rightness of it all the way to the bone. Owen bought the North Parcel land. He bought it at fair price from the original sellers, with the corrected deed descriptions matching the original survey pins that Jacob Beckett had driven into the earth years ago. The transaction was clean and properly filed, and Owen stood in Harker's office and signed his name to paperwork that represented the realization of a decade of patient work and saving and waiting for the right ground. He brought Cora to see it on the day the final deed was recorded. They rode out to the North Parcel on a November morning when the sky was the clear cold blue of the Texas autumn, and the grass had gone gold and the mesquite trees were stripped bare against the horizon like scripture, and Owen pulled up his horse on the rise that overlooked the full breadth of the land and was quiet for a long moment. "Good grass," Cora said. "The best in the county," he said, "according to the surveyor. The surveyor is reliable." He turned to look at her on her horse beside him, the wide sky behind her and the gold land before them, and her dark hair loose under the brim of her hat, because the November wind had a way of dismantling careful arrangements. "I want to build a house here," he said, "a real house, not a line camp, a house with a room for books and a room for instruments and a front porch that faces west for the sunsets." She looked at the land. She looked at where the house would go. She had already privately measured the angle of the afternoon light and knew which orientation would get the best of it. "The northwest corner of that upper flat," she said, pointing. "The ground is firm, there's natural wind break from the ridge, and the view of the sunset from the porch would be unobstructed for about 20 miles. How do you know the ground is firm? I drilled it in the original survey. Good solid clay base at 3 feet. Your well will be reliable at approximately 40 feet northeast of that position." He stared at her. "Your father asked me to core sample that area," she said, with the mild tone of someone providing routine information. "He was interested in the water table 2 years before you arrived. It's all in the field journals." Owen Crawford sat on his horse in the November wind looking at Cora Beckett, and the expression on his face was one that she would remember for the rest of her life. Complete, undisguised, utterly genuine shock and awe. Not the awe of a man made uncomfortable by a woman's capability. The awe of a man encountering a capability that was so far beyond what he had expected that it reconfigured his understanding of what was possible. "You know where my well is," he said. "To within about 6 feet," she said. "The field journal is at home. I can show you the core samples." He took his hat off. He ran his hand through his hair. He looked at the land and then back at her and laughed, that deep, full laugh that she loved, the one that came from genuine joy rather than social performance. "Cora," he said, "yes, I would be honored," he said, "if you would consider making a life on this land with me." The wind moved through the gold grass. A hawk rode the thermal above the ridge without moving its wings. The November sky was so clear it seemed to go back forever. "I surveyed it, Owen," she said. "I know every inch of it. It has the best soil, the best water table, and the best light in the county." She met his eyes steadily. "Of course I'll make my life here." He rode to her side and reached across the space between their horses and touched her face with one hand, and she leaned into it and he said, very quietly, "I love you. I want to say it out loud and in the daylight and on this land so that everything hears it." "I love you too," she said. She said it the way she said everything true, directly, without embellishment, without waiting to be certain because she had been certain for months. "I have loved you since you stood in front of Culver without discussion, and I thought, there is a man who acts from the right place." "That's a very romantic origin story," he said. "I am a practical woman." "You are a practical woman who knows where my well is," he said. and who I intend to propose to properly as soon as I have procured an appropriate ring, which I understand can be done in Amarillo, and who I want to marry in the spring in Redemption Falls, with Martha Hargrove weeping happily in the front row." "She will absolutely weep," Cora said. "I'm counting on it," he said. He had a ring by December, purchased in Amarillo from a jeweler who had a small diamond set in a simple gold band that was elegant rather than ornate, and which Owen had selected with the same purposefulness he brought to all decisions. He asked Cora on a December evening in her small house, kneeling on the floor with the lamp light warm between them, and she said yes without a single moment of deliberation, because there was nothing to deliberate about, because she had read this particular survey completely and thoroughly, and knew exactly what ground she was standing on. Martha Hargrove cried when told, loudly. Thomas Hargrove shook Owen's hand for a very long time and said things that Owen also found very difficult to hear without his eyes becoming a problem. George Alderman, who had written the letter that had started all of it, received a telegraph from Owen that simply said, "Letter arrived safely. Better than the land." George wired back, "Knew it would." They were married in March of 1883 in the Redemption Falls Church, on a day when the spring wind was warm, and the prairie was beginning its annual act of resurrections, the first green pushing through the gold of the old season. Cora wore a dress of cream wool that Martha had helped her make, simple and well cut, with her dark hair pinned up under a small hat with a single white feather. She walked herself down the aisle, because she had no father to walk her and no brother and no male relation who would have understood the honor, and she walked it the way she did everything, with her head level and her eyes clear and her steps unhurried. And Owen watched her come toward him with his hands at his sides, and an expression on his face that everyone in the church remarked on afterward, that specific expression of a man looking at the full sum of a person and finding it without reservation. The most remarkable thing he had ever seen. Reverend Calloway read the service. When he came to the part about who gives this woman, he paused because there was no one to say the words, and Cora, in a clear and entirely composed voice, said, "I give myself," which is the only honest answer to that question. And the church erupted in laughter that was warm rather than scandalized, and Reverend Calloway, who was a good man with a sense of humor, said, "So noted," and continued. Owen's vows were traditional and sincere. When it was Cora's turn, she had written her own, and she had written them the way she wrote everything, with precision and without waste. "I promise to tell you the truth about the land and everything else," she said. "I promise to stand beside you rather than behind you or in front of you. I promise to bring my full capability to our life together and to expect yours in return. I promise to love you for exactly who you are, which is a man who I have found to be worth all the years of waiting." There was not a dry eye in the Redemption Falls Church, including, Cora noted with some satisfaction, Owen Crawford himself, whose eyes were doing something specific and honest in the front of the small white building. They built the house on the northwest corner of the north parcel, where Cora had pointed in November. Owen's brother James came down from Colorado in April to help with the framing, and George Alderman's son rode over with 2 extra men for the raising, and the house went up in 2 weeks with the sound of hammers in the spring air, and the smell of new wood, and the sight of Owen Crawford on a roof beam against the sky looking entirely like a man in the place he was meant to be. The room for books was on the south side, for the winter light. The room for instruments, Cora's workroom, was on the east side, with a wide window looking toward the survey benchmarks her father had set, and that she would now be able to see from her desk every morning. The front porch faced west, exactly as Owen had said, and from it on a clear evening you could see 20 miles of Texas sky going orange and then red and then purple, and then the first stars coming in over the ridge. Owen's cattle came in May, 160 head of good Texas Longhorn purchased from a rancher south of Amarillo who was reducing his operation. Owen managed them with 2 hired hands, a quiet Texan named Pardo, and a young man named Ellis who was 17 when he arrived, and who Owen immediately assigned to every educational chore. The ranch could provide on the grounds that a young man in the 1880s with no education was a young man with no future. Cora continued her surveying work. She had no intention of stopping, and no one suggested she should, including the man who shared her roof and her life and her front porch sunsets. Owen subscribed to the view, which he had articulated on their first evening in this house, that a person's work was part of who they were, and that marrying a person meant marrying the full picture, including the transit in the corner and the field journals on the shelf in the early mornings, when she rode out before dawn to catch a benchmark in good light. He had articulated this view while also making her coffee, because Owen Crawford was a man who understood the practical requirements of coexistence with clarity. By autumn, Cora was carrying their first child, a fact she had determined with the practical certainty of a woman who read physical evidence accurately, and she had told Owen on a September evening on the west porch, while the sun went down in the colors she had documented and never quite gotten over, and Owen had sat very still for a long moment, and then had picked her up from her chair, which was unusual enough in its spontaneity that she laughed in surprise, and held her there in the evening air with the sunset behind them, and said something into her hair that she felt more than heard. Their son was born in April of 1884, in the bedroom of the house on the northwest corner of the north parcel, attended by Martha Hargrove and the Redemption Falls doctor, a competent man named Prout who delivered him with professional efficiency, and the announcement that he was a very large and very vocal child. They named him Jacob Owen Crawford, Jacob for her father, Owen for his, and the double inheritance seemed to carry its own weight in the name, 2 generations of men who had known the value of ground truth. Cora lay in the bed with the child in her arms and Owen sitting beside her with his elbows on his knees and his eyes doing the overwhelmed, honest thing they sometimes did. And the spring light came through the east window and fell on the infant's face, and she thought that she had been called willful for wanting more than what most men were prepared to offer, and that here was the proof of what more had meant. This room, this man, this child, this land that her father had measured and that she had defended, and that now carried her family's future in its ground. Jacob Owen Crawford grew up on the North Parcel land with the particular confidence of a child raised by 2 people who were completely themselves, and who had therefore given him the example of completeness as the standard. He rode before he walked well, which was standard for ranch children, and he followed his mother around survey setups from the time he was old enough to be placed in a sling on her back, and he could read a level bubble at the age of 4, which was earlier than his mother had managed, a fact she recorded in the margin of one of her field journals with a quiet note of professional satisfaction. Owen watched his son watch his mother work and thought about his own mother in Colorado, keeping those careful financial records that had saved the ranch, and thought that the thread of capable women and the men fortunate enough to recognize them ran all the way back and all the way forward, and that Jake Crawford would grow up knowing that the most reliable person in any room was the one who did the work honestly and let the measurements speak. Their second child came in the summer of 1886, a daughter they named Clara Ruth Crawford, Ruth for Owen's mother who had died the previous winter in Colorado. Clara was born in July heat and announced herself with equal vocal force to her brother, and immediately set about being the most opinionated person in the household, which, given the household's existing population, was a significant achievement. Cora looked at her daughter in the July afternoon and thought about all the women who had been called too much, too willful, too sharp for any decent arrangement, and felt something specific and intentional form in her chest like a resolution. "She is going to be absolutely formidable," Cora told Owen. "Terrifying," Owen agreed from his position beside the bed. "I'm delighted. She will need to know that her formidability is an asset." We will ensure she knows this from the beginning. The men who might come along later will need to understand it too." Owen was quiet for a moment. "The men who come along later," he said, "will meet a father who will be very clear about his expectations on that point." Cora laughed at that, soft and warm in the July afternoon, with the windows open to the south wind and the sound of little Jake somewhere in the yard outside telling Pardo something detailed and insistent about horses. The North Parcel prospered. Owen expanded the cattle operation to 240 head by 1888, adding a second well at the position Cora had identified from the core sample data, which came in clean and reliable at 38 feet, 2 feet shallower than her prediction, which she noted as a minor personal failing, and Owen refused to treat as anything other than impressive. They built a second barn, a proper equipment shed for Cora's instruments and the growing collection of survey tools she had added to her father's original set, and a small bunkhouse for the ranch hands that had doubled in number as the operation grew. Cora's survey work expanded too. By 1887, she had been retained by the county for all official boundary surveys in the Redemption Falls district, a formal appointment that came with a title and a modest county stipend, and that represented, to her mind, the completion of a circle that her father had started. Her name was in the same official records as his. Her benchmarks were beside his. The land kept both their records. She had also, by this time, trained 2 assistant surveyors. Young Ferris, who had covered for her files during the Price trouble and who turned out to have a natural aptitude for field work, and a young woman from west of town named Addie Marsh, whose father had brought her in one afternoon saying that she was good with numbers and could Cora use an assistant. And Cora had spent 30 minutes with Addie and the girly transit and said yes immediately. Addie Marsh was quick and precise and fearless about early mornings and hard terrain, and she reminded Cora of herself in ways that were both gratifying and occasionally alarming. Owen, encountering Addie at the end of a field day when she and Cora came back covered in dust and arguing good-naturedly about a reading discrepancy, looked at the two of them with an expression of deep, warm satisfaction and said he was glad they had found each other. The summer of 1889 brought 2 things to the North Parcel. The first was a drought that gripped the Texas Panhandle with the methodical cruelty of a region that had always balanced abundance with its opposite, and that required Owen to make hard decisions about herd size, water access, and the careful management of the 2 wells against the disappearing surface water. He made these decisions with the kind of sustained pragmatism that had always characterized his best thinking, reducing the herd by 30 head in June, redrilling the north well for additional depth in July, and arranging a water-sharing agreement with 2 neighboring ranches that benefited all 3 operations through the dry August. The second thing was a letter from George Alderman's son, who had gone on to study law in Dallas, and had written to say that the Price case had been cited in a state land fraud proceeding in Austin, that Cora's original survey documentation had been used as an evidentiary model for the investigation, and that there was talk among the state land office of formalizing survey standards that would make the kind of fraud Price had perpetrated substantially harder to execute going forward. Cora read this letter 3 times. She read it once to process the information, once to understand the full scope of what it meant, and once simply because the thing her father had said came back to her with a completeness it had never quite had before. The land keeps honest records. The benchmarks stay. The measurements speak. She brought the letter to Owen where he was working on the fence line at the south boundary, and she read it to him while he sat on the top rail with his hat on the back of his head and the drought-pale sky above him, and when she finished he was quiet for a long moment. "Your father's surveys just changed state law," he said. "My father's surveys and my documentation and Harker's integrity and your standing," she said. "It took all of it. But it started with your father putting iron pins in honest ground," Owen said, "and you refusing to let anyone pull them out." She stood in the dry August grass with the letter in her hand, and the south fence stretching away on both sides and the house, a quarter-mile north catching the afternoon light. And she thought about the chain from Jacob Beckett's first survey in this county to this moment on this day, and felt the continuity of it like a physical thing. He would have been so proud, she said, not for the first time, but with a depth that was new even to her. Owen climbed down from the fence rail and wrapped her in his arms there in the August heat, and she leaned into the solid fact of him, and he pressed his lips to her temple and said nothing, because nothing was what the moment required. Jake was 5 years old and Clara was 3, and the ranch had survived its first drought, and the state of Texas was improving its land recording standards, and Cora Beckett Crawford's name was in the official county records alongside her father's in a way that would stay there as long as there were records. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. The drought broke in September with 3 days of steady rain that came in from the south and soaked into the cracked ground with the patience of long-deferred abundance. Owen and Jake stood on the porch and watched it come in, and Jake put his hand out into the rain and said something about how the ground was drinking, which was precisely the right way to describe it. And Owen looked at his son and thought about all the years of patient work that had brought this particular child to this particular porch on this particular piece of ground. That evening, with the rain still coming down softly and the smell of wet earth coming through the open windows, they sat together at the kitchen table, Owen and Cora, with Jake drawing horses in a notebook and Clara asleep in her room, and Cora had her father's field journals open on one side and her own on the other. Comparing a benchmark reading she was preparing to verify in the morning. Owen was reading the letter from George Alderman's son again, because there was something in it he wanted to understand better, a reference to the specific survey standards being proposed. The proposed standard requires chain of title verification to correspond with original survey markers, he read aloud. Not deed descriptions alone, but physical markers. Cora looked up from her journals. That's the change that matters. Deed descriptions can be rewritten. Iron pins cannot be moved without the movement being documented against the original survey, because the original surveys are in the field journals. And the field journals are in the county record, and mine are in the county record alongside my father's, and together they represent a continuous record of this land going back 30 years. Owen set the letter down. He looked at her across the table in the lamplight, with the rain on the roof, and she looked back at him with those clear, direct eyes that had seen him accurately from the very beginning, and he thought that there was a version of his life where he had come to Texas, found the land clean and easy, bought it without complication, built a ranch and lived quietly and never met Cora Beckett. He could not now conceive of that life as something he would want. It was like imagining a map with half the territory left blank. Cora, he said, yes. Do you know what I think when I think about the fact that Harold Finch called you willful and left? She put her chin on her hand and looked at him with a smile at the corners of her mouth. Tell me. I think Harold Finch did me the greatest service of my life, he said, and I hope his cattle are doing fine on whatever dry land he ended up buying. She laughed, clear and warm in the rain-smelled night. Jake looked up from his horses, saw his parents laughing, and went back to his drawing with the complete equanimity of a child who had always known that his parents found each other funny and good. His cattle are probably fine, Cora said. He did eventually have someone look at that south parcel properly. Someone. Ferris did the survey the following spring. Owen shook his head in slow, appreciating admiration. Of course. The parcels were all accurately described in the end, she said. Everyone's cattle survived, and you surveyed all of them. Someone had to do it right. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, large and warm and certain, and she turned her hand palm up and laced her fingers through his. And outside the rain fell on the north parcel land that her father had measured and that she had defended, and that they had built a life on together. And the benchmarks held in the wet earth as they had always held, quiet and true, refusing to be moved. Jacob Crawford's field journals, 30 years of surveys. Cora Beckett Crawford's field journals, 15 years and counting. A child learning the level bubble at 4 years old. A daughter who was already formidable and hadn't yet learned to walk steadily. The land keeps honest records, and the life Cora had been told was too willful to build turned out to be exactly right. In the spring of 1891, when Jake was 7 and Clara was nearly 5, and the Panhandle had recovered its color from the drought years, and the grass on the north parcel was as good as George Alderman had ever promised, Owen built something new on the land. It was not a barn or a shed. It was a marker post, a proper iron post sunk 3 feet into the ground at the northwest corner of the house lot, carved at the top with a compass rose and below it the words, Beckett CRAWFORD Survey, EST, 1882. It was the kind of marker that professional surveyors set at significant points, a permanent record of who had stood there and measured from that point outward. He installed it on a Saturday morning in April with Jake beside him, holding the plumb bob to verify the post was vertical, a job the boy took with the gravity of a professional. And when it was set, Owen stood back and looked at it in the spring morning and called for Cora. She came out of the house with Clara on her hip and stopped when she saw it. She stood very still for a moment. She crossed the yard slowly and ran her fingers over the carved letters, Beckett Crawford, her name first because she had been here first, and she felt her father's name in hers and her own name in Owen's, and the whole chain of it running forward into Jake's serious little face and Clara's wide, curious eyes. Owen, she said. The land should remember who surveyed it, he said. She set Clara down and turned and stepped into his arms and held on with both hands to the back of his coat, and he held her there in the spring morning, with the meadowlarks going in the grass and Jake carefully checking the plumb bob for a second time to be completely certain of the verticality. She did not say anything for a long moment. She did not need to. The marker stood in the April light on the northwest corner of the north parcel, on firm clay ground above a clean, reliable water table at 38 feet, facing a view of the Texas sunset that went 20 miles unobstructed to the west, on land that had been honestly surveyed and honestly purchased, and honestly lived on by 2 people who had found each other through the particular grace of a fraud case, a transit instrument, a jar of wildflower honey, and the accumulated wisdom of a man long dead who had taught his daughter that the land doesn't lie. Cora Beckett had been labeled too willful for any decent arrangement. Owen Crawford, the decent man, had heard that and said it sounded about right. And the land, as it always did, kept the honest record of what happened after.